Well, hey everyone, welcome to the show. This is the Alisa Childers podcast. I'm Alisa Childers. And as always, it's our goal to equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And I want to say a special thank you to everyone who came out to our very first Unshaken conference of 2025. That was at Calvary Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was such a wonderful time. It was high stress because we, as the speakers, had all new talks. So I had to prepare and give 3 brand new talks. I talked about false justice. I talked about the pro-life cause. And my opening talk was about what time is it? What is our cultural moment that we're living in right now, and how, as we, as Christians, can be prepared to speak truth into a culture that is not just kind of confused about morality and Christianity, but is actually quite hostile to it. So we had a great, great time together. It was Natasha Crane and Frank and I, and we have 3 more that are coming to you in 2025. So if you're anywhere in the Honolulu, Hawaii area, we'd love to see you come out in May for that. And we also will be in Southern California and Dallas. You can go to unshakenconference.com to register for those. Now, today's episode is with my friend J. Warner Wallace and his son, Jimmy Wallace. I am so excited to bring this to you because if you're interested in bringing the Christian worldview into culture through the arts, this is a great episode for you because Jay Warner and Jimmy are a father-son team who have just come out with a graphic novel. It's got a crime sort of theme, and they're addressing apologetic and theological points along the way. And so we're talking all about the process of how they went about producing this graphic novel. My son read it and he loved it. So we talked about that and just how Christians can bring those things into the general consciousness of culture, really through the arts in a way that is compelling and that is well done with excellence, which they have totally accomplished. So here is J. Warner Wallace and his son, Jimmy. So Jim and Jimmy, so great to have you on the show. I am so excited to talk about this new graphic novel that you have just put out. And it's the first in hopefully many volumes called Murder and Meaning. And I'm looking at the artwork right now. We've got a picture up on the screen that we'll put up. Just beautiful artwork. It looks really cool. I know my son really loves graphic novels, so we're going to get into all of that. But I want to just let our audience know a little bit about you guys because you are a father and son. My audience will probably be fairly familiar with you, Jim. But let's start with you, Jim. Just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what made you want to write a graphic novel like this. Aside from the fact that I told you need to, like 4 years ago. I don't know if you remember that, but I was like, you got to
that's
do a
right.
graphic
You know what?
novel.
I'm so glad you reminded me of that. That's
Yeah.
crazy. Anyway,
It
yeah.
just, it
So
stuck, obviously.
yeah, it did. Yes, it did. Yeah, you can tell. Nothing at this age sticks. Okay, this goes right through fast. This is how fast will it go through is the question. Anyway, yeah. So I think for us, I mean, as you know, I became a Christian through the evidence, and I never really all the way through after I left law enforcement, I never really saw myself as a Christian apologist. I mean, I was just a retired cop. And that's always how I've seen myself, as just a guy who came to faith through the evidence. And if you want me to share how that looked, I'm happy to share that with you. If it helps you, great. But I mean, I'm in a season now where I get to hang out with my son, who's on the job now about 13 years, and kind of reliving. It's so cool for me. It was hard for me to leave the job. It was hard for me to leave the agency. But now to relive so much of it, because he's, kind of had all the assignments that I had as I came up the ranks, to watch him kind of relive all those 25 years later is kind of cool because it kind of keeps me updated. But so yes, we wanted to write I wanted to do fiction at some point. I knew I would be doing fiction at some point, but I think I underestimated that the challenge it would be. It's one thing to collect evidence and then just kind of reiterate the evidence back to a jury, make a case. And writing a nonfiction book, which is about data collection, like what's the evidence, spend a couple of years collecting the evidence, and then figure out a way to articulate the evidence to others. That's kind of native to what detectives do. But fiction is an entirely different beast. And that's why I think really for me that probably the extent of the fiction I'll probably ever write will just be helping Jimmy as he writes these. And his story is a little bit different than mine, but I think that together we can actually we can do something in this space of Christian fiction,
Right.
at least do graphic novels.
And you're both police officers, which is cool. And
Mhm.
Jim, your dad was a police officer as well, right? So it's 3 generations?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, he's still kicking, and it's still a challenge for Jimmy and I on occasion. But yeah, I think we listen to his stories. I listened to his stories growing up. Jimmy listened to his stories and my stories growing up. Now the two of us are listening to Jimmy's stories, so it's been kind of a cool experience.
That's very cool. Well, Jimmy, tell us about yourself and kind of what your daily life looks like, and maybe get into a little more of what made you decide to go ahead and pull the trigger on writing a graphic novel like this.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I've been very excited to write a graphic novel. I think this has been like a lifelong dream that I never really seriously thought would ever happen. Growing up, everybody in my family were cops, or if they weren't cops, all the men were in the military. So I grew up with all these kind of police stories, but so that really motivated me to go into law enforcement. But on the flip side, a lot of the men in my family had comic book collections that they shared with me. My dad would once a month go and give us $1 that we could spend at the comic book store. And some of the comics, the old comics, were like a quarter, so you could get 4 of them, which was really exciting. And so comic books were always something that I read growing up, and I guess I never matured out of them. I'm not sure if I was supposed to, but I've just continued to read comics my entire life. And so I think I always would have dreamed to write a comic book, but I didn't think that that was a very reasonable expectation. That wasn't a good career path. So instead, I followed the family business and went into law enforcement. But now it's kind of coming full circle. Now we finally get to work. Number one, we get to work together. I've always been really motivated by my dad to get into apologetics. A couple of years back, I went and got a degree in apologetics. And right as I was graduating out of a program, we found out that one of the book publishers he'd previously published books with had bought a comic book company. And it was like all the stars aligned. I had these 3 great
Yeah.
loves: law enforcement, apologetics, and comic books. And somehow God had lined it up that maybe we could do something that involved all 3 and that we could work together. And this book is the result of that.
I love it. Well, and also I'm excited that you guys have done this because I know just from my personal experience with my son,
Mm.
when I was growing up in school, we had to read all these really difficult classical literature books, and it kind of made me hate reading. And it put this bad taste in my mouth about reading. And I've heard people talk about a better approach is to maybe let people read what they want to read, develop a love of reading, then you can move on to the hard, the more complicated and complex literature type stuff. And so I've sort of taken that approach with my son, who absolutely loves reading comics. He could just absolutely not care less about a chapter book that's got no pictures, but you give him a comic book, he will read it several times even. So
Wow.
yesterday, I gave him your book and I said, "You're going to get a week off of literature," because we homeschool, so I can do things like that. I said, "You're going to get a week off of your literature book if you will read this book and give me your honest review." And I said, "I want an honest review." And he goes, "All right, I'll go start right now." And I knew he was excited about it because it was the evening and he didn't actually have to do any work. But he went in his room and I didn't see him for an hour and a half, which tells me that's all the review I need right there, because it's not like 10 minutes later he was poking his head out like, "Yeah, I think I'll try again tomorrow, finish." Like, he was into it. And I know that this is marketed as a graphic novel for adults, but he's middle school age, and his honest review, he'd only read about half of it, but he said, "I really think the pictures are really cool." Like, he specifically said, and he said, "The words are good." He said, "There were a few too many words, just a few too many words."
Yeah.
But I can tell it totally engaged him and he really loved it, which makes me feel good as a mom because I know that coming from you guys, you're going to be weaving in bits and pieces from the
Right.
Christian worldview. And
Right.
so one of the things that I think a lot of people have critiqued about quote unquote Christian art is that it's like you have to put the whole gospel message in one thing, and then it's bad art because, and honestly, I think that's what we're seeing with some of the woke stuff. I think that's one of the criticisms of the new Snow White movie from Disney, is that it's
You're
just
right.
like a woke infomercial and you don't have any elements of character development or real art done with it. So I'm really excited about this, and I'd love to get both of you to comment on, maybe Jimmy, we'll start with you. What do you think is the main, maybe apologetic point or Christian worldview point that you're trying to weave into this volume 1 of Murder and Meaning?
Yeah, before we get too far, I think you've touched on something a couple times I want to make sure I highlight in case we don't get a chance to come back around to it, and that's the art. We really were carried by the art team. We had 2 great artists, Steve Crespo and Dario Farmasani, who did the art on this comic. And The way I've been kind of trying to explain it to people who aren't big into comics is that as the writers, we came up with a story. We wrote a script that was sort of like a screenplay. You can kind of think of that. But if we're using the movie analogy, the artist ends up being the actor, the director, the costume designer, the set designer. They're deciding the lighting, and they really take on a lot of hats. And so if you read this and you enjoy it and you think we did something good, it's probably as a result of the art, because the art is the lens through which you see our story. So I just want to make sure we shout out to them. We're so thankful that we got to do that with these two artists. I mean, we were really lucky. In terms of the apologetic message, one of the things that I noticed as a police officer, even early in my career, now I was a Christian way before I became a police officer. So Christian worldview was always sort of in the back of my mind, but I started to notice as I'm learning in the academy in my early days on patrol, all the laws and procedures that I have to follow as a police officer. One of the most important things was this idea of preserving human life. There's these rules that say like, hey, I got to respect people's privacy. I can't just go walk into their home and kick down their door and go rooting through their stuff. But if I'm walking down the street and I hear you calling for help, I can kick down your door and run in and try to save your life. And so even though there's this Fourth Amendment protection against for your privacy, your human life is so important that preserving it supersedes all other concerns. And as a Christian, I noticed that I could ground that. Why is human life so important? But most of the cops around me just assumed it. Human life is of the utmost value. But few of them could have probably told you why is human life valuable. And so this is one of many Christian arguments for the existence of God, that human life has value. And if human life has value, therefore there should be a God. There's an apologetic argument to get there. And so when we were talking about, hey, what do we want to talk about in a Christian comic book that is related to law enforcement, we had a couple different ideas, and this was one of the first ones we thought about. Was let's try to talk about the value of human life. Does human life have value? And if it does, what does that say about greater worldview questions like, is there a God, or what would be our purpose or meaning?
Yeah, because if the Darwinian paradigm of evolution is true, then there's no reason that anybody should assign any more value to human beings than they would to anybody else, aside from the fact that we're conscious and we don't want to be hurt, and maybe you wouldn't want to hurt anyone else. But there's no objective standard outside of us by which to say that we would have more value than, say, a dog on the street or a fish in the ocean or a cow that we might eat as a hamburger. But it's interesting that in all spheres of life, people just innately sort of recognize that there's something different about humans. And so, Jim, I'm curious to hear from you, because you've had all these years of experience in law enforcement. I'm sure a lot of these biblical principles get played out in a very big way just when you're arresting people or when you're interviewing victims and criminals. And so what have you observed in your life as a police officer that brings some of these things to light? Since 2017, over 140,000 family farms in the U.S. have shut down. Well, this is because a lot of the meat that we buy in grocery stores isn't coming from American farms anymore. It's imported from overseas, where mass production and low costs take priority over true quality. Well, this spring, we're going to change that. It's time to spring into action and put American farms first, because nothing beats American quality. And that's exactly why I choose the brand GoodRanchers.com, because it stands for integrity, tradition, and 100% American-raised meat. And right now, Good Ranchers is running their Spring into Action promotion, so you and your family can support local ranchers and easily get American quality delivered right to your door. When you subscribe to any of their boxes, you'll get free add-on for a year. You can choose between chicken nuggets, free bacon, ground beef, or wild-caught salmon in every order for a year. Use my code Alisa, and you will get $40 off your first box. So go to GoodRanchers.com. Again, use my code Alisa for that $40 off and add on for a year. GoodRanchers.com, American meat delivered.
Well, and I can tell you this, not just for sure, we recognize, and everyone recognizes innately, that there's something that's more valuable probably between a human and, let's say, the dog, or let's say another species. But here's what's interesting. It turns out that these kinds of murder cases almost always reveal that we're struggling to kind of ground value even between two humans. So, for example, today there's going to be a dozen murders in the United States, and you're probably not going to hear about any of them. None of them, unless, of course, a celebrity is killed. And now suddenly it's going to be national news. What is it? Why is it that we think that that person is worthy of our attention, but these others aren't? That's one of the things we're going to examine in this serial killer that's basically targeting victims that have more and more cultural, quote unquote, value. And we're asking that question, is that true? And look, this is the case if you're working as a detective, that if you get assigned a case that involves somebody of no social status at all, and your partner gets assigned the case that involves the mayor's daughter, you're like, I want that case. Well, why? Why do you? Because you think somehow that's going to, number one, even if you don't think that person's more valuable, you might think that your investigative work on that case is more valuable. So here's what happens. We typically assign value to people based on their doing. We don't see each other as human beings. We see each other as human doers. And the people who do and achieve and become something are just assigned more value. We just need to kind of look at that issue. And so what we have in this story, and Jimmy's done a great job of crafting it, is we have a bunch of detectives who are working this case and struggling with the idea that the victims are becoming progressively more notable in terms of the
Mm.
culture's paying attention to these victims. Now we better get moving on this because the next one could be who knows. And we're in Los Angeles County where you have celebrities and all kinds of other things. So it's set in Los Angeles County, but also with the detectives themselves are struggling with their own value. Like, what makes me valuable? And that's something that Jimmy's been very intentional about in how he crafts these characters. And one of the reasons why this is the challenge, right, is that so much. So if you're somebody who just loves the kind of graphic view of this, I think we have partnered with the kinds of artists because we have a high, like I was raised in the arts, so I have a high value for what I would say is important. And art's a big deal to me. It's in all my books. We illustrate all of our books. So we wanted to find the right illustrators. But even more importantly, I think we're looking at how do we develop characters, deep, real characters, not just cartoon characters. If you like the art, this is going to move you. But if you're somebody who likes character development, that's what we're trying to do here, because it turns out it's in the character development that those issues about human value are going to play out. So if you're somebody who's young, my hope is that we draw you in with the art, but we start you thinking with the dialogue,
Right.
start you thinking with the character development. If you're somebody who likes character development, we hope to move you quickly through with the art. So we're trying to do both.
Yeah. Well, Jim, why do people innately know that there's something more valuable about humans? Like, what is the worldview nugget there that the Bible teaches that you're trying to convey through the book?
Well, okay, yeah. So it comes down to identity. Like, what makes you important? And what I see all the time, and I talked about this with you last time we were together on the Truth and True Crime, is that we typically will assign our value to something that we worship, something that we think is valuable. If it's our work, it's because we've achieved so much. If it's our appearance, it's because we care about beauty, we care about how we look. If it's a relationship, it's because I think the relationships are important. So I am so and so's spouse. So we're connecting to something we think is of value. And that's the problem, is that all those things are temporary things that can easily be taken from you. And so you're going to, in the end, human value has to be grounded in something transcendent that is unflinchingly unable to, you can't lose it. So that's why we would say as Christians that in the end, and this is what David Foster Wallace, the author, said, who was not a believer, but he recognized too, you'd be wise to put your identity in some God thingy of some sort, something spiritual, something
God
that
thingy.
transcends you. And he wasn't quite sure what that might be. But you and I know what that is. And
Right.
so we just need to have characters who are struggling through this. So if you read this book, you're going to get probably 70% in before you go, is this a Christian book? So,
Yeah.
there's nothing that hat tips this or that tips it off until you get to a place where we're starting to look for alternatives to all the ways these characters cannot ground their value.
Hmm.
So I think that's what we're trying to do. This is a book that you're absolutely right. We don't want it to be. We're not smuggling in the gospel in every single line, but in the end, I hope you're going to come through it and say, yeah, that was worth thinking about. And it
Yeah.
turns out the view I'm holding may not be able to ground value. And we
Yeah.
think that the better way to ground that, of course, is in God.
Yeah, right. And of course, Bible teaching that humans are made in the image and likeness of
That's right.
God is,
Image bearers.
yeah, we're image bearers, and dogs and the seals and the fish and all that aren't bearing the image of God, although they're created by Him. Jimmy, without giving too much away about the story, what can you tell us about the story? Maybe about the main characters. Are these going to be the same main characters in each volume, or will there be a new cast each time? What's your vision for it?
I think in terms of, I'll answer the end part first and then go backwards. But I think in terms of future volumes, we will have each story in the same world and a lot of the same characters will appear. But I think I want to be sensitive to the idea that each one of these books may be the first for somebody. So I think we're going to try to get each one to stand alone and make a different apologetic point as we go. And so we might focus on different characters for different stories, but you're going to see a lot of the same characters. If you enjoy volume one, A lot of the same characters are going to be in volume 2, although their exact role or where the emphasis is might change. I think for me, one of the things that I really noticed in law enforcement is something that I've seen myself. I have to like kind of keep myself in check regarding this. Is I see cops take a ton of identity in their work. The status as a police officer is so important to most, if not every single person that I work with. And I think that can be really great because it can really motivate you as an employee. You really want to go out and you want to do good things and you want to excel in your career. And I think there could be something good about that. But I think there's a double-edged sword, which says this thing we're taking identity in, police work, is temporary. And actually, most cops don't really work for that long. 25 to 30 years is considered a long career, at least here in Southern California. And that's not a big portion of your life. My grandfather, who we were talking about earlier, he's been retired for longer now than he worked. So if you take your identity, what makes you important is this thing that you do, well, eventually it's going to go away. And so that's kind of where we took the first tact in this first volume. The main kind of focus character is this guy, Murph. He's at the end of his career. He's a very accomplished detective. He lives and breathes police work, but now he's eligible for retirement. So he knows that the only thing he has going for him in his life is this police work thing is soon coming to an end. And now as he's doing this investigation, he's starting to confront these ideas of what makes people valuable and where does he get his own value from. And at the same time, he's working with younger police officers who still think they can find identity in this thing. They still want to move forward in their career. And regardless of what opinion we take, if we say everyone has value, even if it's equal, or even if we said, no, people do have different value based on what you do, your beauty, et cetera, regardless of your personal opinion on that, if we're going to say someone has any value at all, we have to be able to point to something outside of ourselves that would actually give us value. And ultimately, I think that the only thing that would give us true value would be something that is transcendent, eternal, and that does not change. If we put our value in anything that changes, like our career, which can go by the wayside, we can get injured and retire early, we're not going to find true identity, true lasting identity in those things.
Did you base any of these characters on people you know or that you've worked with?
I think that they're all types of people we know.
Okay.
There's no person who's like, that guy is exactly this person. We just changed their name or something like that. Added a mustache where they don't have a mustache in real life to disguise them. But I hope that each of these characters feel real. That was one of the first things that we did when we were creating the stories. We created 6 kind of general characters who we ended up changing a lot as we went through the revision process. But we wanted each of these to be really different from each other, but really strong types where any police officer or someone who knows someone in law enforcement will look at one of those and go, oh yeah, that's my partner. That's my dad. That's my cousin, whatever. And we really just wanted it to, although it's not a true story, we wanted it to feel real.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's something that when we definitely, there are characters in this book that I look at, I'm like, oh, I can put a name on that. I know who that is. And we've talked about this. We had an overlapping career, Jimmy and I, so we knew a lot of the same people that he worked with as old guys that I worked with as young guys. And this is the kind of thing that we can actually point to now to create characters, hopefully, that if you are a cop or if you just, and that's where I think the difference is for us. We watch a lot of shows and we see these shows that are out there. And to be honest, none of them are very good. And it's not because they don't have good character development. It's because, to be honest, the characters aren't typically adjacent enough to what we see in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
So what we wanted to do, and I think if you read the dialogue, you're going to laugh at times because this is what cops like do. This is what they say to each other. This is what we say to each other when we're standing in a murder scene. I wish it was more, in some ways, more philosophical or more, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's just, this is the conversations that you hear when you're in those scenes. And we wanted to kind of replicate some of those.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves when I'm watching crime shows is when you have 2 police officers. They're both detectives, usually, and they're looking at a body, and the one detective will say to the other detective, oh, the blood spatter went that way. That means X, Y, or Z. And the other one's like, he knows that. You wouldn't tell him that. He would already know that because this is what you do. And they're telling that, obviously, for us, the audience, which I think is kind of insulting to the audience to think that we would ever buy that 2 cops would talk to each other that way. So I appreciate that. I can definitely appreciate that. I'd love to get both of your perspective on something because I think as police officers, you are often interacting with maybe the worst of our society as far as people's behavior and maybe even the types of trauma that they've been through and the abuses that have been done to them that they're now perpetuating onto other people and all of those things. I'm curious to I know, Jim, for you especially, as I read your book, Cold Case Christianity, which I still recommend to everybody, even your perspective as far as eyewitness testimony goes, and even our sin nature and how that plays into certain things. What are some observations in your entire time as being a police officer that you have seen about human nature that really, of course, we have the grounding for that in the Bible. The Bible has answers. A Christian worldview has answers for those things. But I remember hearing you once even talk about how before you were a Christian, you would arrest people and you kind of saw them as being, I forget how you worded it, but more other. But when you understood what the Bible says about human beings, then you started to realize your own sin and the conviction of that you're really no different than them in certain ways. But what have you observed about human nature in your time as a police officer? Parents of young children are always asking me, what is the best way to prepare my kid to encounter all of the crazy ideas that they're going to come across in culture, and particularly surrounding issues of reproduction, gender, sex, and all of those related issues? Well, I want to recommend to you The Talk Made Easy. It's a curriculum released by Foundation Worldview that will help walk you step by step through talking with your child about God's good design for gender, sex, and reproduction when they're between the ages of 4 and 7. This is such an important time because we as Christian parents can be the first people to introduce this topic to our kids and showing them how beautiful God's design is for these things. So go to foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa to get the entire 3-video series for $14. Again, foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa.
Yeah, I know that kind of observation, that kind of reality, that epiphany moment when you realize that was even powerful for Jimmy when he first started working. I think for me, it's how do you ground what you're going to see? And that, however you ground it, however you explain it, is now going to have explanatory power for the next thing you haven't yet seen. So it's important for us to figure out what is the template, what is the worldview that becomes the structure that we have. So, for example, if you're part of a secular worldview and you think that humans are innately good, then they are simply corrupted by the systems around them. Those systems can be families, organizations, cultures, societies, countries, okay, whatever. But if you think we're innately good, we're born as a clean slate. And so that means if that's my view, I can expect that those people who maybe have been raised in quote unquote good homes are going to be better because, they've been protected. They haven't been corrupted, allegedly, right? But of course, if the opposite is true, if we are innately fallen to the point where we are not going to be corrupted by a system, we will be the corrupter of the system. Well, that's an entirely different view of humans. Now, if you have that view, and that's a biblical view, now I didn't have that from the Bible originally. I sadly kind of got that from the way I was raised, because I was raised by a single mom and the struggle was real. And I can tell you that I had a glass half empty view of the world before I ever became a cop. But if you start with that view, the view that people are innately fallen, and that changes things. Number one, it changes your expectations, for example, of witnesses. Look, I think that the part of the problem with witness testimony is that you see that not everyone's going to be perfectly descriptive in how they offer something. Not everyone's going to be perfectly accurate in how they offer something. I've never had an inerrant witness, and but I also don't have an expectation of that, because I know the nature of people, and I take a view that we're innately fallen. That means we're finite and we're limited. So that's how I don't have an expectation that I'm going to get perfect witnesses. My expectation is I'm going to have to test everyone, figure out what's good, what's bad, and just because you make a mistake does not mean you're not reliable. We have a jury instruction for that, by the way, that says you can make a mistake and still be considered reliable. But I didn't have a problem with it because my expectation was people are a mess. So don't be surprised when people are messy. Now, this is also true then when I encountered other people at work. When people are put on uniforms, the superheroes, and we see this a little bit more in the modern depiction, and Jimmy would be a better expert on this than me, but I think if you were to look at superheroes back in the 60s, I'll bet you they had fewer character flaws than they have today. Because we have a sense that, yeah, these are like a real people. So when you watch a Marvel movie, you get to see the dirty side, the gritty side of the superhero.
Right.
Well, that's true because this is the nature of humans. In fact, you put on a uniform as a superhero or as a cop does not change who you are. You're still the same struggling person. And I think that's something that, Jimmy, you saw when you first became a cop, right?
Yeah, I think maybe as a kid, you're thinking like, oh, I'd like to grow up and be a cop, and because you play cops and robbers, and you have this idea that that means that there's like good people and bad people, and these
Mhm.
are like separate categories, and but that's just not the reality. You're really, I don't know that I've, at least in my, maybe somebody's experiences, I don't know if I've ever encountered an unsympathetic suspect, regardless of how heinous their crime was. And I don't, it's not as though the most hardened gangster never took their kid to get a Happy Meal or their girlfriend to Disneyland or whatever, like they, as though because they're a killer, they're incapable of love or something like that. And
Yeah.
on the flip side, I've never met a cop who was this wonderful paragon of virtue. Of some of the best and most successful police officers I knew had gone through multiple divorces or were just absolute workaholics and weren't there for their kids. And they were doing good things for the world, but to say they're good, all good people as though they're separate from the bad people, is just a way oversimplification. And so I think, at least as a Christian going into this, knowing that every prophet and patriarch of the Old Testament have their own egregious character flaws, and that the Bible
Yeah.
teaches we're all sinners and none of us even come close to the glory of God. I think the seeing the actual reality of human nature in law enforcement didn't really shake my faith. It probably only reaffirmed what I was being taught in Scripture. Now I'm really feeling it as I see it right in front of me.
Yeah, that's a really good point that both of you have just brought up, because I think many of us who grew up in church were presented with these Old Testament stories, like all of these guys, like you want to be like David, you want to be like Noah, you want to be like Moses. And then when you get a little older and you're past the coloring book phase of your Christian discipleship, and you realize, oh, David was an adulterer and a murderer, and Noah, got drunk, and Moses did all these, and you're like, I really think maybe the only Old Testament character that really was just virtuous from start to finish was Daniel. And I think, Daniel's kind of an interesting, he's different than the rest of the Old Testament characters that we often were taught were heroes, when they were really flawed people that were, seeking relationship with their God and trying to figure things out with their God. And that's a great point, because I think that can actually lead to some of the deconstruction that we see, is if you've been given this sort of glossy, oversimplified version of even good and bad, where everything's all good or all bad, then people can't really discern how to put those categories together when there is such a flawed person in there. So I appreciate that you're giving us maybe flawed characters. And for anybody who's listening on audio and you're not looking at the video, behind Jimmy's head, which kudos to you for maybe the coolest background of anyone. This is just stacks of file boxes, and which with some cool lighting. So Jimmy, what's in those file boxes? Are those all graphic novels?
Oh
Well,
no, oh
yes.
no!
Well,
What's funny is he's about to reveal, right?
Okay.
So you're going to be. What do you think, Jimmy? You think she's going to be disappointed or not?
well, you know how every Christian apologist now is like required on YouTube to have like a library of books. So you think like they've
50,000
read
books,
every
yeah.
systematic
Yeah.
theology that ever existed. It's like, well, I got to impress people with my literary knowledge. So I put all my comic books here behind my head.
I
These are
love it.
all, yeah, graphic novels. In the cases where there are graphic novels or just regular old comic books. A graphic novel is essentially a comic book. It's just a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit longer. And we bind it a little bit different, but otherwise, yes, they're all comics.
Yeah. Now, your dad mentioned a minute ago that you've been reading comic books since you were a kid, and how the characters might have changed. I'd love to know your perspective on that. How have the heroes changed? I mean, I'm even just thinking of the Superman movies from when I was a kid,
Mm.
and Clark Kent is virtually not just Superman physically, but kind of morally and ethically. He's just this, always does the right thing, always has the right call to make. And yet we see, not just in movies, more complicated portrayals of our superheroes now, but I think in real life people are kind of coming around to that. So what's your observation as reading these as a kid and where it's come now? Like, what's the difference? But I'm not into graphic novels at all, so I wouldn't even begin to know. But versus like the, I don't know, 80s and 90s versus now.
Well, I'll just give you a very brief and shallow history, I guess.
Mm.
When comics started, I think that the first superheroes were pretty two-dimensional. I wouldn't say I think there are exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, if you go back and you read Superman stories from the 40s, yeah, you're going to get relatively shadow. The good people are really good, the bad people are really bad. And I think we have Marvel Comics, and in particular Stan Lee, to thank for this idea of a flawed superhero, a superhero that does not always win all the time, or even when they win, they lose. And that's kind of evolved over time. But for me, I grew up with a collection that my uncle had left at my grandmother's house, and a ton of those comics were these Stan Lee Spider-Man comics and a bunch of X-Men, which is a whole nother story. But what I really was moved by as a kid, and I would actually say that a lot of my moral development might be more strongly influenced by the comic books I was reading, even though the whole time, or a lot of that time, I probably was already a Christian and reading a Bible, at 8, 9, 10 years old and going to church and stuff like that. A lot of my moral development, I can thank to these comic books. And I don't know that that's where I should be getting my moral teaching, but that's what was influencing me as a kid. And one of the things that really stands out even to me today was this idea that Spider-Man was this character who everything always went wrong for him. He always could just barely pay his rent, and he was always helping out his sick grandma. And he'd finally get the girl who was way out of his league to agree to go on a date with him. And right before he got there, some supervillain would attack, and he'd have to make this decision. Do I go to the date, or do I stand her up and go fight the villain? And he's always got to make the decision. I got to do the right thing and stop the bad guy, even though it's going to personally cost me. Now I'm going to not go to my job, and I'm not going to make enough money to pay my rent, or the girlfriend is going to think I'm a loser because I never show up and I'm always being flaky. But that taught me as a kid, hey, there's this strong association of self-sacrifice and virtue. If I want to be a virtuous, good person, I need to be willing to be self-sacrificial. And for me, that was a really positive thing. And at least in those days, in the 60s, probably most comics you read, they might not be Christian, but they're not anti-Christian. They're going to still be consistent with a Christian worldview. Today, that's not the case. But for me, I always enjoyed that aspect of comic books. They're very edifying to me. And I think in writing this comic book, I wanted to give something back. Now, if I go to a comic book store today and buy a comic, I probably am not going to feel like my Christian worldview is supported. There might be, even if I enjoy the story, I'm probably going to have some things I got to, squint at or hold my nose to, or just, I can't give my whole heart to the content.
Yeah.
And here I would hope that we created a graphic novel that as a Christian, you can read it and go, hey, I can give my whole self to this. I'm all in. This is great. I really enjoy this. This is edifying in some way.
If you're like me, you love coffee and you love the pro-life cause. Well, that's why my favorite coffee company is 7 Weeks Coffee, because they're on a mission to fund the pro-life movement, one cup of coffee at a time. And to date, they've raised almost $1 million that they've given to pro-life centers all across the country. They've saved thousands of lives. And when you subscribe to 7 Weeks Coffee, not only do you get shade-grown, low-acid, mold-free, organically grown coffee that is the best coffee you will ever have, but you also get to know that when you drink your coffee, you are helping pro-life resource centers all across the country. So go to 7 Weeks Coffee, and right now, when you subscribe, you're going to get their new single brew coffee bags to take your coffee wherever life takes you. You're going to get a 2-pack, so whether you're traveling, working, or adventuring, you can easily enjoy a rich, flavorful cup of coffee by just adding hot water and letting it steep for a few minutes. Go to 7weekscoffee.com. Use my code Alisa to save up to 25%. Again, 7weekscoffee.com. Use my code Alisa. Yeah, so here's just based on what you just said, kind of brings up this point in my mind, because I, a few minutes ago said, there can be maybe an error on the side of just making everything so sanitary that you don't even realize people have struggles and flaws. But then on the other side, as you point out, so many of the quote unquote heroes today in the movies we see and even the books we read are actually pretty bad people. So what do you guys think about, and this is something I've thought a lot about too, is like, it's one thing, because I agree with you, Jimmy. Like, I grew up with, I don't know if you guys, this was probably before your time, Jimmy, maybe Jim. Well, you weren't a Christian yet, so you wouldn't even probably know the Davy and Goliath claymation cartoons.
No, those were super popular growing up. They were popular amongst people who weren't Christians.
Oh,
yeah,
I didn't
Davy and
know.
Goliath.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I think because of the claymation. It was just, it was on every morning.
So I loved those. And I know, like, looking back, so much of my character development was based on what would go on in Davy and Goliath. It's like, and Davy was sometimes a naughty boy, but he would always have conviction. He would apologize. He would make it right. And you always had to go and do the right thing. A Little House on the Prairie, similar kind of stuff going on there.
Right,
so
right.
Jim, maybe we'll start with you. I'd love to get both of your thoughts on this, but like, what is the balance? How do we strike the balance of, like, we want it to be edifying. We want, like Jimmy, to be able to look up to people and say, that's a behavior I want to emulate, but without sanitizing it so much that then we feel like, oh, if we make a mistake, it's all gone and I have to deconstruct my faith.
Yeah, no, well, it's a good point, because I think that a couple of things. When I listened to Jimmy talk about the power of fiction to shape character development, it becomes like this an identity issue. Like, who do you want to be like? And often fiction does a great job of doing that, more so than if I gave you an 8 bullet point thing. Like, this is what it is to be a good person, 8 bullet points. Well, that will have some persuasive ability. But if I simply show you a story in which someone who possesses those 8 attributes becomes a victor in some way, or experiences some series of events in some way, that story is going to suck you in, and actually probably going to do a much better job of providing you a structure. This is why stories like Spider-Man probably influenced an entire generation of people. Now, for me, for example, I learned everything about what it was to be a dad and what dads were to do, not from my dad, because my parents divorced when I was 3 and he didn't raise me. I didn't have a dad at home, but I did. My mom was constantly gone, working all the time. So I was kind of like a latchkey kid from a very early age. So we had a TV, and that TV was on, and I knew every time, every day, when the reruns of The Rifleman would be playing. And for me, The Rifleman was the place where I learned what it is to be raised by a father, because it's fiction. But here's what's great about it. At least it was fiction that held a Christian worldview. So it promoted a Christian worldview. This was a single man raising his son, in which the relationship between him and his son was very biblical. And it was for the most part, it set the priorities of my own life as a young person. I wanted to be like him. Now, what I do think, though, is that in the end, our Christian worldview has to make, and cops know this. This is why I think so few cops are Christians. But those who are know that your Christian worldview has to make sense of more than just the Pollyannish kind of parts of your life, those areas in your life that are not troubling, because we're going to see a lot of troubling things. And if Christianity is true, it has to make sense of the mess. It has to make sense of all the train wreck stuff that people experience in their lives. So how a 10-year-old gets killed. Why would God allow this? I mean, whatever your Christian worldview is, the strength of it is going to be pressed into service as you're trying to make sense of messiness. So this graphic novel wants to do that. Look, in the end, you can't hardly blame some of these characters for not paying attention to God, because they're surrounded by all this chaos. But the reality of it is that your worldview does determine how you behave in the chaos. So we're trying to say, hey, it turns out some people, there's one character in here, without having to tell anyone why this is happening. We want him to be the guy who's kind of like bulletproof. I mean, he's able to process things at a slower pace and kind of see the long movie rather than the one scene we're in. He understands the movie, not just the scene. And this is, I think, something we should be able to do as Christians who have a long view of eternity and not a short view of the 90 years between birth and death. So we want to kind of offer that. But yeah, for sure, the messiness has to exist in the story, because if Christianity is true, it's the one worldview that should make sense of that.
Yeah, it's good. Any thoughts, Jimmy?
You know, earlier we were talking about like the fallen Old Testament characters, and you had mentioned the word hero. And I think that there is a tendency right now to think that if we refer to someone as a hero, they better be all good or almost perfect, and that any person who's got major issues we cannot refer to as a hero. And I think this is something that I don't know if I struggled with, but I started to notice as I got older, maybe my teenage years, I started to realize that there's a lot of colorful characters in my family. I had a big family growing up, and a lot of the people that I loved, crazy uncles and great grandparents and stuff like that. As I got older, I started realizing, oh, they've got actually a lot more colorful pasts, or maybe even presents than I realized, right? And so there was this question I think I had in my mind of, well, what do I do with that then? I love these people, but actually maybe they're not everything that they should be. And so I think, at least for me, maybe I was lucky in that sense. I had to wrestle with this idea of what is a hero, or what would make a good leader. And I think that the Bible, the Old Testament, but all the way through the New Testament, we see only all the heroes, all the leaders, everybody we're supposed to go to for wisdom. They're all pretty messed up. And so I don't think that if, as a Christian, I didn't have this worldview that says I need everything to be perfect and sanitary, and I can only love what is perfect. I can't love anyone who's sinful or is struggling with something. But ultimately, if we're going to say someone is truly good, what would we compare them to? It doesn't seem like it's just going to be a question of, if you've sinned, you've done something wrong, you're bad, and if you're perfect, you're good. There's got to be something else. And I think this we might be straying now off the topic of the comic book, but I think there's something about the idea of repentance, and that a person who is sinful but is willing to change and try to make things right. I think that kind of I think that's something that the Christian worldview offers that I think I don't really see in the culture around me. There's this lack of repentance or forgiveness. Maybe there's no repentance because there's no possible forgiveness. There's not a lot of people out there saying, hey, if you did some hellacious thing 15 years ago, but you repented of it, we'll forgive you. I don't really see a lot of forgiveness. So then I also don't really see a lot of people being willing to repent.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
insightful.
but he's traveling in this direction because that's kind of where the next book we're charting is probably headed, is in these issues of repentance and forgiveness, right? But I think that this is what's so great about taking a long view of how to. So we don't have to be overly ambitious with this book. This book is going to be just examining a small piece. Now, because it's only examining a small piece, we can do all kinds of character development, storytelling that we don't have. Not every single scene has to be the thing that's leading you to some bigger gospel message. And you're right about this. I mean, I've been involved in Christian movies, and I know that we have to resist the impulse to preach from scene one. And preach completely. Like every single thing I know about the gospel has to be described in this movie. Well, one of the benefits of doing a series of books is that we can look at the long expanse of what we're doing over, say, 4 or 5 books. And that's what we're trying to think about. Like, so if we get an opportunity to do many of these, we don't have to be overly ambitious with any of these. And so that's what we're thinking. It gives us a little bit of a leg up in terms of how we approach the topic.
Very good. Well, as we close out here, any final words you want people to know about the book or the series, and maybe let us know where they can get them. I'm looking at it on Amazon. It's coming. It's out by the
Mhm.
time this airs. It'll be out, and people can get that on Amazon. What else do you want everyone to know about this and all the information?
Yeah, here's our hope. Our hope is that sometimes you get an apologetics book that either you've written on or that I've written, and we kind of feel like this is really all you need in this area to kind of flesh out your entire worldview. We try to write comprehensive books. That's not what this is. This is really a narrative for this. We want this to survive as a fiction book first. But so what we want to do is connect this. Then we see it as a gateway book. Our hope is that you'll read a book like this and it'll cause you to start thinking. If you're a Christian, I hope it's going to strengthen your faith. If you're not a Christian, I hope it starts you asking questions. And then the question for me becomes, well, what are we gatewaying to? So at the back of the book, there's a QR code that has our short case for the resurrection of
Oh,
Jesus.
good.
It's not like we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus in this book, but the one of the characters does hold a Christian worldview. Well, how is he grounding that? He's a cop also. We kind of give you a cop view of that. So we have a free digital download for anyone who buys the book. But here's what's more important to me. Online, you'll see that as this is launching, we try to give away free resources for every book we do. So here, the free resources are going to be a digital copy of that book, of course, that is downloadable separately. Also, a conversation guide that'll help you have the kinds of conversations that we hope this book will provoke. So if you've given it to somebody who's not a believer, we've got a little conversation guide that'll help you engage them in conversation about the book, or about just the topics, not the book. Secondly, we know that if you're interested in using this book as a tool, well, you may not feel like you're great at making the case for Christianity generally. So with every purchase of this book, we're making available our 30-session, 10 and a half hour case makers course, which is
Wow.
fully, blown out in terms of like fill-ins and all of the paperwork side of it as well. But it's a video course, and that's available for free. It's going to take you from everything from truth to the resurrection to the Christian worldview as it's applied to other things, art, literature, music, education, all that stuff. That course is available for anyone to buy. Why? Because I think, number one, I don't know how you feel about this, Alisa, but I feel this way. I constantly feel like I think I told you this when I first mentioned, I don't consider myself a Christian apologist. This is just how Jimmy and I grew up in the faith. We had he got a chance to see what it is to make a case, and that's how he grew up in the faith. This is how I got saved. So here we are now as detectives who want to share that view with you. If it helps you, great. But that's not who we are. That's just what we're doing right now. And so what we want to do is say, hey, I hate to sell books. I wish I could just give you the book. And so what we're going to do is give you enough extra stuff that it doesn't feel like you're spending much to get the book.
Good.
Because I think that I don't want anyone's perception of any of us on the screen right now, the three of us, that this is what's motivating us. We want to basically make money from you. That is not what's motivating us. I have a pension. So we have to eliminate that motive. And so I think what we try to do is offer you a bunch of free stuff so you can at least see that that's not our motive here. The motive is when you get saved, that the level of joy, I can see what's driving Jimmy. What's driving Jimmy is he's saved. And
Yeah.
he feels like, I just want to share that with somebody. I feel the same way.
Yeah.
And that's what drives all of us to do shows like this, is we just, or write books or do anything that's out of the box, is we're saying, what can we do now to, so much has been done for us, and gratitude, what could we do in response?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what this whole project's about. So anyway.
Very good. Final thoughts, Jimmy?
Glory to Jesus Christ. I hope this is an edifying book to you, and I hope you enjoy it.
All right. Well, I want to thank my guest, J. Warner Wallace, and his son, Jimmy Wallace, and their new Murder and Meaning Case Files Volume 1 graphic novel. Pick it up for anyone in your life that you think might respond to a resource like this. Like I said, my son got really engrossed in it and really loved it. I'm looking forward to reading it myself. And let's remember, as we pursue Christ, to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.